Densha de GO!
After the unprecedented success of the Famicom, Super Famicom, and Game Boy, the mid-90s saw Nintendo stumble. Twice. The Famicom had defined video games in 1980s Japan, and its American counterpart, the NES, resurrected the North American video game industry. The Super Nintendo was a phenomenal success, and it was only John Kalinske running Sega of America that stopped Nintendo from single-handedly ruling the 16-bit console landscape. And the Game Boy, the first globally successful handheld console. The beige brick was a phenomenon, selling millions upon millions of units and lasting into the next millennium. For many young gamers, this was their first machine, and the Game Boy proved that playability is the most important aspect of gaming. Graphics mean nothing. Entering the 90s, Nintendo were video games, with Nintendo the brand becoming shorthand for video gaming. Nintendo was a verb, a pronoun. In fact, such was its ubiquity that the Big N was concerned about generification, that they would lose control of their brand. Unassailable by competitors, but not immune from themselves. In 1995, Nintendo released the Virtual Boy, a 3D console using two screens of red LEDs and an oscillating mirror. The results were not great, and the machine died a quick death. A big stumble for Nintendo. Then came Project Reality. Nope. Then came the Ultra 64. Nope. Then came the Nintendo 64. Late into the 3D era and sticking steadfast to conventions of the previous generation. While the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation preceded the Nintendo 64 and defined how this new 3D polygon era would look, Nintendo took their time and went their own way, very much to their detriment. The Saturn and PlayStation went for the latest storage tech, the CD-ROM, a format that allowed for masses of information to be stored on a medium that was very cheap to produce and reasonably resilient. Nintendo stuck with the cartridge format, a format with incredibly fast loading speeds to keep up with the ultra-powerful hardware, but at the cost of storage capacity, which at best was 11 times smaller than the CD and came with extortionate production costs. Publishers on Sega and Sony's machines could pump out games for pennies at a time, risks could be taken, demos could be stuck on the front of magazines. For a publisher on a Nintendo platform, it was far more complex. You had to buy your cartridges from Nintendo, in advance, at enormous cost. Bigger games required bigger cartridges, which came with even bigger price tags. This squeezed out third-party developers and guaranteed, much like every system since, that Nintendo could only rely on their first-party titles. There was the Nintendo brand still going strong, but it was Sony who were becoming the new default name in gaming. The giant who had defined gaming in the decade prior now had a bloody nose. Densha de GO 64 released in 1999, a year that saw the gulf between the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation widening irrecoverably, and it's clear to see why. In theory, this is Densha de GO 2 ported to the N64, but we'll see there are enormous differences that set the two apart. Firstly, on booting up the game, you are instantly confronted with the limitations of the cartridge format. The beautiful CD audio and FMV of the PlayStation version has been replaced with MIDI music and in-engine cutscenes. And while there are masses of N64 games with outstanding music, Densha de GO 64 is not one of them. But put that aside for now. As we know, Dengo games are meant to be played in silence. The attract screen and the music featured in the menus are here due to arcade convention. What we care about is the trains, routes, and how the game performs. In these respects, Dengo 64 does not let us down. At first, 16 routes are available grouped into regions of Japan. The PlayStation has a scant 10 routes, not including the hidden one. Oh, and look! The Yamanote line is back, and there are two new lines, the All Main line and the Tazawako line. Unfortunately, the Osaka Loop and Kagoshima remain PlayStation exclusives for now. The full lineup for Dengo 64 is the Hoku Hoku line, Akita Shinkansen line, Ore Main line, Tazawako line, Keihin Tohoku line, Yamanote line, and the Tokaido main line. Much like the PlayStation's Densha de GO 2, the Tohoku Shinkansen is hidden away alongside a few other trains and track variants. The Keihin Tohoku line is extended to Ueno if you get a great rating at every station on the way to Shinagawa. This is very tricky, and you can only get one good rating or the whole thing is off. The Tohoku Shinkansen is unlocked by getting a good or great when pulling into Morioka Station on the Akita Shinkansen route. There are trains to unlock by completing all the routes. Same as Densha de GO 2, you are awarded stars for finishing runs. Use too many continues and you get a bronze star. 1 to 3 continues for a silver star, and a no continue run will bag you a gold star. Getting any star on all 16 runs will unlock the 485 Series 3000 config on the Hoku Hoku line. All silvers and above unlocks the direct service E3 on the Akita Shinkansen line, and all golds get you the 200 Series Shinkansen, which originally launched in 1982, the E2 Shinkansen and E3, all to run on the Tohoku section of track. That is a lot of content for what's already the biggest game in the series so far. There's also a good assortment of trains from the get-go, but nothing astoundingly different. In fact, there are a lot more commuter trains here again. The high-speed edition tagline from the arcade version is rightfully missing. The 201 series has been around since the late 70s, and only last year saw the final trains decommissioned, with only JR West hanging on to theirs. The 205 dates back to 1982 and can still be seen in service today for JR East and West. A lot of old stock was shipped off to Indonesia to run on their Kai commuter system. The JR West version of the 207 is still going after 30 years of service. These days it can be found on the Tokaido mainline and Sanyo mainline. The 209 series that runs the Keihin Tohoku in-game, like most trains featured in these games, is still in use, having been refurbished and updated over the years. For those of you who are Tokyo bound, you'll see them on the Chuo Rapid Line service and the Hachiko line. This sweet looking commuter train is the 223 series, which is still in heavy use in Western Japan. If you hop on the Osaka loop, there's a good chance you'll be hopping on one of these. It's the successor to the 221, both of which are in-game and run the Tokaido line. The 485 is famous among Japanese rail fans for its unique style. They ran from 1964 to 2022 all across Japan in varying capacities, including as a sleeper train. These days they've been decommissioned, but earlier 481 models have been preserved, and one fine example can be found in the Railway Museum in Omiya. The 681 series Snow Rabbit Express train has a top speed of 160 km an hour, and thereby dipping its toe in the high-speed rail transit world. Despite its high numbering, the 701 series is a fairly generic commuter train that has been around since 1993. This train runs the Tazawako line in-game. The Akita Shinkansen, Hoku Hoku Keihin Tohoku line, Tokaido mainline and Tohoku Shinkansen have all been discussed in previous videos. New lines, Ore and Tazawako, are located in the east in close proximity to the Akita and Tohoku Shinkansen lines. The Ore main line runs from Fukushima to Aomori. In the game, the route starts at Akita and terminates at Omagari. The Tazawako line also hosts the Akita Shinkansen Komachi trains. The complete line is 75.6 km long and runs from Morioka to Omagari. In-game, we get a section between Tazawako and Morioka stations. It's unusual to have such a well-connected section of tracks, but it was convenient in that the assets could be shared between routes in-game. It also gives the world a more connected feel, rather than just a group of discrete tracks. While there are more tracks and more rolling stock, there is a complete absence of bonus materials. No train photos, no cinematics, no 3D models of trains. This feels like an outsourced affair with minimal extra content. It's quite surprising coming from the PlayStation version, which was bursting at the seams with goodies. Or, all the available space on the 30 meg ROM was already taken with track data. This also gels with the general presentation. Anything outside of the main game loop feels a bit cheap. But let's get stuck into that. How does it perform? Well, pretty amazingly actually. It does feel different. I broke out my notes from when I played the PlayStation original and tried to apply them to this, only to come a little unstuck. It runs very smoothly. I didn't detect any slowdown while playing, even when coming to some of the more populated stations. The notorious fog on the N64 is actually put into good use here. A colour is added to the trains in the background that really boosts the illusion of depth while mitigating the trains popping into existence. And the cityscape seen in the background in Densha de GO 2 on PlayStation is weirdly zoomed in here, taking up much more of the horizon. There's the usual perfunctory tutorial stage that teaches you how to succeed on one small stretch of track in one train in one weather condition. Rad. Almost entirely useless. In addition, there are practice stages for Keihin Tohoku, Tokaido Mainline, and Akita Shinkansen that set the waiting time to 999 seconds, allowing you to cruise the route to your heart's content and get in some much needed practice. Like previous versions, a specialised controller was released, the Densha de GO 64 controller. It's the standard two-handle affair and is the way to play. Interestingly, it requires a specific port to be used. The PlayStation and Saturn controllers can slot in the first controller port, but the N64 controller must be attached to port 3, and you have to select it at boot, and once selected, whatever pad is in port 1 is deactivated. This seems weird as, in theory, it's just another controller that outputs combined commands. Let's have a look at what happens in the controller tester ROM. That's interesting. All these button inputs are entirely possible on a regular controller. The N64's controller D-pad did have a rocker in the middle making up and down combinations impossible, but this uses no such combination. Looking at this, you could easily spoof it with a normal pad. Also, the inclusion of the Z button for master controller combos is really weird. Why not use it for all the settings, or not at all? There are more than enough combinations to cover the 6 steps on the controller using the D-pad alone. And the emergency brake section seems to flit between 3 or so different combinations. This might be why controller port 1 is disabled when using the Dengo 64 controller. Finally, let's discuss the single most unique feature of Densha de GO 64, the VRS, the Nintendo Voice Recognition System. Jammed specifically in port 4 or it won't work, the VRS lets you live out your wildest conductor fantasies by announcing starts, stops, and rail signals. Correctly doing so will award you with bonus time. The VRS is an incredibly niche accessory that only works with 2 games, Dengo 64 and Hey You Pikachu. It's completely bonkers that research and development money was spent on a device with such limited use. It was made for the Tamagotchi clone Hey You Pikachu, a game in which you bark orders at the electric mouse in the faint hope it'll do something. It's safe to assume that Taito saw potential in voice controls and began to look for ways to factor it into their upcoming N64 game. But there it is, a fairly easy way to bag some extra waiting time. Every time there's a signal or a station, you bark out a noise and earn a free second, which really makes a difference, and it's not that hard to do. For example, the first stretch on the Hoku Hoku line has 16 voice prompts, most of which simply require you to say Shinko and thereby bagging you an additional 16 seconds. Which you'll need, as, like the other ports of Densha de GO 2, it's a right bugger. The difficulty is still very noticeable. The Hoku Hoku line is still the bane of my existence. The other tracks are fun to play, in particular the lengthy Akita Shinkansen. Full disclosure, I ran out of time trying to 100% this game, so I used cheats to get the last few gold stars needed to unlock the high-speed trains. Speaking of, the high-speed runs are really good, requiring small adjustments along the way to get the station pass bonuses. They're pretty chill and give a real feeling of distance covered, a feeling later recreated in Densha de GO Sanyo Shinkansen. There's a good variety of tracks, and while we are missing the Osaka Loop, the inner city Keihin and Yamanote lines do take the edge off. Weather effects are still present, but like Dengo 2 on PlayStation, they feel far more manageable, and stopping only requires braking a bit earlier and no longer needs a panicked brake lever locked to notch 8. But it is still an absolute git, still retains the arcade 100 yen chomping roots. Warning signs and speed limit notifications appear 0.5 to 1 second before you're penalised. Oh, and do well at your peril again, because a surfeit of waiting time will really piss the game off and guarantee adverse weather conditions or just an arbitrary 45 km an hour speed limit. Usually when you're going a good 100 km an hour, and this gives you an instant game over. It's such a tool. In our ever-growing tier list, where does Dengo 64 live? I have to say that despite the lack of bonus content, the sheer variety of tracks and trains is really good. There's a lot of game here, as I found out to my horror, which explains why this video took so long to make. I have to say this might be the first entry in our A ranks. It looks good, plays well enough, and has the VRS, making it stand out among the other versions of Densha de GO 2. Oh, and on that, there are another 4 versions of Densha de GO 2 to go through yet, so don't be surprised if all these videos get a bit samey for a while. That will do us for now. Join us next time for another monochrome jaunt on Bandai's Wonderswan with Densha de GO 2. See you at the next station.